Thank you all for coming. Before beginning, I have to say, being at this conference to give this particular talk reminds me of a job interview that I once went on. I walked into the room and the executive asked me, he said, DJ, what's your best quality? And like every applicant, I made up some stuff about myself, how hard I work, my dedication. But then he asked me, he said, DJ, what's your worst quality? And I said, well, when someone asks me my opinion, I assume that they want it. And I fear I may be about to make that same mistake. I don't expect everyone to agree with everything I say. You may not agree with anything I say. And no one has ever accused me of being subtle. In fact, my wife says that I'm a human trigger warning. And I may be about to trigger some of you today, because I'm going to try to convince you that some of the biggest problems faced by the seriously mentally ill are as a result of what we do, that we are the problem, that we are misleading government officials, and that is why the seriously mentally ill can't get treatment. I am going to try to convince you that we fail the seriously mentally ill when we mislead government officials into denying violence rather than taking steps to reduce it. We fail the seriously mentally ill when we try to convince government to spend on improving mental wellness in the masses rather than delivering evidence-based treatment to the seriously ill. And we fail the seriously mentally ill when we try to convince government that it is stigma rather than lack of services that presents the major barrier to care for the seriously mentally ill. Now let me explain why what I'm saying is different than most mental health advocates claim. I am not a mental health advocate. I am an advocate for the seriously mentally ill. To put that in perspective, 100% of the population can have their mental wellness improved. 18% have something that's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but only 4% have a serious mental illness, meaning one that creates a functional impairment that inhibits their ability to engage in daily life activities. Now, we can argue whether it's 2%, whether it's 6%. The boundary may be debatable, but the extremities are clear. If you think the FBI planted a transmitter in your head, chances are that's serious mental illness. John Hinckley shot President Reagan because he knew, not thought, he knew that that was the absolute best way to get a date with Jodie Foster. That is serious mental illness, and we are failing people with it. The first way we do this is we fail the seriously mentally ill when we mislead about violence. After incidents like Parkland, Virginia Tech, Aurora, Colorado, we pull out our most popular claim: the mentally ill are no more violent than others. Nonsense. The untreated seriously mentally ill are more violent than others, and we in this room know it. Our psychiatric units are locked. Liver units aren't. Psych nurses wear panic buttons. Those in cancer units don't. Our outreach workers go out in pairs for their own safety. We're doing workshops here how to protect the behavioral health force, and we want contracts to train police to deal with people who have mental illness, not psoriasis. Of course, the untreated seriously mentally ill are more violent than others, and we fail the seriously mentally ill when we try to hide that because we prevent solutions. Now, why do we do it? We think it causes stigma to admit the mentally ill are more violent than others. Nonsense. It is not admitting to violence, it is violence by the minority that tars the majority. If we really want to reduce stigma, we have to reduce the violence. And this is something that we have prevented in the mental health industry. As a result of our not focusing on the seriously mentally ill and denying violence exists, there are 400,000 people with mental illness, serious mental illness, not just mental health issues, serious mental illness who are incarcerated. 750,000 are on probation or parole. Now, we like to blame police when something goes wrong, but the police step in when one condition is met. The mental health system fails. And in New York City alone, they went on 165,000 EDP, emotionally disturbed person calls last year, almost all without incident. But over 25% of all officer line of duty deaths are on EDP calls, calls to people we claim are no more violent than others. And we mislead about the other form of violence, our violence to self, suicide. Another one of the industry's real popular claim is that suicide is the second leading cause of death in kids under 24. Now, the claim technically is true, but it's only true because kids rarely die of anything. Thank God. Suicide is primarily an adult disorder. And as you can see by the black bars in this chart, 5,500 suicides were under age 24, 37,500 were over it. But as a result of our saying we have to spend more to prevent suicide in kids, SAMHSA has spent $54 million to reduce suicide in the under 24 and only $2 million in the older 24. As a result of our efforts, our misleading, suicide funds are going to where suicide isn't, to kids. And as a result of that, more adults are dying. Now, the second way we fail the seriously mentally ill is when we mislead officials into thinking we should spend more improving mental health and mental wellness in the masses rather than on treating the seriously ill. As a result of our advocacy, the ability to get care has largely become inversely related to need. The least seriously ill are going to the head of the line, and the most seriously ill are going to jails, they're going to shelters, they're going to prisons, and they're going to morgues. We did that. Now, I know this group favors community spending, and as you can see, that's where state funding is going, reinvestment. Funds have been moving from state hospitals, which by definition serve the seriously ill, to community programs. And this is what's been happening. This is state spending over time. But that's not where patients are moving. Patients are moving from hospitals, which are going way down, to jails, which are going way up. But we in the industry still claim that if we reduce hospitals, we will reduce institutionalization. That has nothing to do with reality. There are people, and by the way, the difference in the totals between 1960 and today is largely accounted by homelessness, so the total institutionalized is roughly the same. Now, we have to start ending this mental illness to jail pipeline. And there are several ways we can do it. We should support hospitals. And that means eliminating the federal government's IMD exclusion, which is federally sanctioned discrimination against the mentally ill. We have to make it easier for people to get treatment before they become danger to self or others, rather than preserving laws that require them to become danger to self or others. And that means we have to stand up against Bazelon, protection and advocacy, the ACLU, radical peer communities, the Center for Mental Health Services, and others who believe being psychotic, delusional, hallucinating is a right to be protected rather than an illness to be treated. And we have to vigorously support assisted outpatient treatment. Now, assisted outpatient treatment is only for a very, very tiny percent of the population. It's for a subset of the 4% who don't voluntarily engage in treatment. And what it allows is it allows the courts to order the person to accept community treatment for 1 year, so they continue to live in the community. It's less expensive, less restrictive than inpatient commitment or incarceration. And as you can see from the chart, it reduces homelessness, arrest, incarceration in the 70% range, and that research holds up wherever it has been used. AOT is not an alternative to community treatment. It is a way to see that the most seriously mentally ill can get into it, and we should be vigorously supporting it. But rather than supporting these things which really can help the seriously mentally ill, we mislead officials into supporting programs and supporting efforts that really don't have an impact. One of our most popular claims, if we intervene early, we can prevent mental illness. And everyone in the industry spouts this. Nonsense. We know that schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, two of the major serious mental illnesses, cannot be prevented. In fact, we'll know when it can be prevented because surely there will be a Nobel Prize to whoever figures it out. Now, it is true we can prevent progression of illness, but that means treating people who have it, not people who don't. We mislead about risk factors. We wrap everything that makes you sad in a mental health narrative, whether it's poverty, bad grades, unemployment, angst about sexual identity. These are all now mental illness conditions, or they're risk factors for mental illness. If we start spending our money on all these things that make people sad, what's left for the seriously ill? And because we mislead about what constitutes a mental illness, we mislead about treatment. Anything that makes you happier is now a treatment. Now, don't laugh at my dog. I love my dog. Being around my dog makes me happier. But that does not mean my dog is a therapy dog, or that every dog is a therapy dog. Mindfulness, meditation, yoga, dancing, art are all now therapies to treat mental illness. And when we start diverting our funds to all those efforts, what's left for people with serious mental illness? As a matter of fact, we won't even say mental illness anymore. Some of the very major advocacy groups now require us to say mental health condition. Mental health condition. To me, a mental health condition is what somebody who doesn't have mental illness have. They have a mental health condition. I want that. Now, I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to ask, if you can, to raise your hands and keep it up. Okay. How many of you have ever known someone who died? You lost a friend, a parent, a sibling. How many of you, anybody here ever keep your hands up, were in the military? Anybody ever had an abusive parent or partner? Keep your hands up. Anyone ever lived, like I did, in a poverty area or a crime-ridden area? Has anyone ever witnessed violence or had an accident or was divorced and one parent? So many of you raised your hand. You can now claim you have trauma. And in the mental health industry, trauma has become the explanation and the justification for everything that happens to you for the rest of your life. He had trauma. Nonsense. Let me say very clearly, trauma, as you can tell by people who raise your hand, is not a mental illness. PTSD is, and even that can run from mild to severe. But if we're going to divert mental health funds to solving all trauma in the world, what's left for the seriously mentally ill? We mislead about peer support. Now, a lot of people who I respect immensely say peer support is terrific. Let me just say, that's, as I wrote in Psychiatric News, it's not what the research shows. The research on peer support is done by adding peer support to what people normally get. But they don't compare that to adding a professional social worker to what people get. They research adding peer support to adding nothing. Would outcomes be better if we added professionals rather than peers? I can't tell you how many professionals come up to me and say that they believe that adding peer support is being done at the sacrifice of quality to lower costs, but they're afraid to speak up. Don't be afraid. Speak up. Be a leader, not a misleader. And we mislead about kids. I don't know how many of you saw this headline. More U.S. children diagnosed with youthful tendency disorder. Now, it's true, it's from The Onion. But it could have been from this conference. One of our most popular claims, half of all mental illness begins before age 14. Again, the claim is technically true, but most of those are mild illnesses, and they don't become serious mental illnesses. Serious mental illnesses generally appear in the late teens, early 20s. They are not predictable, and they are not preventable. But when we start throwing money at kids who don't sit at the exact right place on our bell curve, we're diverting money from kids who really do have a serious emotional disturbance. We mislead about evidence. All of us claim our programs are evidence-based, and we all keep touting this word evidence-based. As James Coynes wrote, evidence-based is too often an ill-gotten branding based on weak evidence generated by the promoters of the treatments who want us to ignore their conflicts of interest. Now, to be evidence-based, a program should meet 3 criteria. It should have evidence that's independent. It should improve a meaningful metric like homelessness, arrest, incarceration, suicide, needless hospitalization, and it should do that in the target population. Yet we claim our suicide programs are a success based on the number of calls to a suicide helpline, not whether suicides are going up or down, and by the way, they're going up. We declare our outreach programs a success by measuring the number of contacts, not whether anyone got treatment. We declare our education programs a success by whether people who receive the education feel more or less educated, not whether on any mentally ill got treatment. Now, this picture often makes people smile. And so all I have to do is tabulate how many people smiled when they saw the picture. And I've got myself an evidence-based program proven to improve mental health. It's called dog costume exposure therapy. No mental illness, no serious mental illness is needed. And I'm glad we're all having a good time, but this is true. This is what's happening to the seriously mentally ill. We're being shunned and shut out of the engagement. And that brings me to the biggest fail of all, stigma. We keep teaching officials that stigma is the biggest barrier to care. Nonsense. Any mom of somebody with serious mental illness, any social worker who works in this room knows that the biggest barriers to care is there's no services available. There's no hospitals to refer to, there's no programs to refer to, there's no clubhouses, there's no place to refer to. And the CEOs in this room knows that there's not getting paid enough Medicaid funds, so they can't hire the best staff or build the facilities. There's no transportation options. The cost is too high. The person has anosognosia. They don't know they're ill. All these are far bigger barriers to care than stigma, but we go out there and we teach the governor and the mayor, oh, you gotta fight stigma, you gotta fight stigma, and we applaud them when they're fighting stigma. At the same time, they're cutting our programs. Our stigma campaigns, I believe, are harmful. They actually hurt. We won't show a psychotic, delusional person in our public service, our public awareness activities. We show high-functioning executives, and then we claim that everyone can recover. That's not an education campaign. That is a propaganda campaign. There are people who are seriously mentally ill, and we have to stop shunning them. And let me say this. Our stigma campaigns, I used to be in advertising, they are ineffective. They will never, ever work. No stigma campaign of ours is going to trump the visual of 17 dead students at Parkland, Florida, or dead people at the Waffle House just recently. As a matter of fact, Parkland is a great example of how off-base we are. We argue that we shouldn't take guns away from the mentally ill. because that would cause stigma, and they're no more violent than others. So as a result of that policy, we sent trauma workers to Parkland to help students get over the trauma of being shot by somebody we claim is no more violent than others. That's ludicrous. In the aftermath of these incidents, we should do what the students did. They went to Tallahassee to urge the governor to take guns away from the seriously mentally ill. That will do far more to reduce stigma, far more to reduce trauma, and far more to reduce dead people than arguing the mentally ill are no more violent than others, and it will cause stigma to take their guns away. Stigma has become the black hole of our advocacy. We're diverting tens of thousands of advocates from fighting for the real changes that are needed to this amorphous thing called stigma, this unmeasurable thing called stigma. And it's causing great harm to many, many people. So next month is Mental Health Awareness Month. I beg you, don't use that to teach the public that there is stigma and that you're against it. Use it to teach the public that we need more housing, we need more rehab programs, we need AOT, easier access to civil commitment, we need better Medicaid rates, we need ACT and ICM teams that are true to the model. We need to get the people who work in this room lower caseloads and livable salaries. That's what will improve care for the seriously mentally ill. Now, just before ending, I want to say I really I've been out in the wilderness. I'm not towing the company line. Pete Early, who's speaking next door, wrote a terrific review of my book, and he said, DJ's never going to get invitations to speak because his... And I think I proved that. Because he criticizes the people who should be inviting him to speak. So the fact that Linda and Jeannie invited me here today and that this packed room came to hear it, I really feel good about that. I know that what I'm saying is controversial. I know nobody's going to agree with everything. But I do know we all want to have fewer homeless, incarcerated, arrested, seriously mentally ill. I don't doubt that. And I know everyone in this room, even those who disagree with me, are working for that. And I thank you.